And coming up is my interview with undercover investigative journalist and activist Geoff Regier. Now, Geoff might not be a well-known name to many of you, but Geoff was recently in the news this past June. You might recognize some of his videos. With the help from Mercy for Animals, Geoff went undercover to document the absolute atrocities which are happening inside of our farms. There may be some uncomfortable video scenes in this next interview, so here is your trigger warning. Trigger warning! And here's my interview with Geoff Regier. You're listening to the Block E Podcast.
My name's Geoff, and I am very passionate about animal rights. I used to be involved in human rights issues, but my focus is much more on farmed animal rights now. Because when you compare any cause that you could put your time, energy, and efforts into, and if your goal is to create a world with less suffering, you have to work on animal rights, because in terms of the intensity of suffering that particularly farm animals endure and the quantity of suffering, nothing compares. And of all the causes, animal rights is just so accessible to someone like myself, really anyone in the developed world, and the impact you can have is so much greater than any other cause I'm aware of. So yeah, that's why I focus on animal rights. I grew up on a small family farm, a hobby farm, and I loved animals. And all kids love animals. I think I loved them a little bit more. And I remember telling my dad when I was a kid that we could cram even more cows and pigs and sheep into the pens we had in the barns, and I thought that would be just the best thing ever. And I lived across the street from the Greater Vancouver Zoo, and so when I was old enough, when I was 12, I started volunteering there and eventually working there, and I loved it. I got to hang out with animals all the time. What I didn't realize then, but what's obvious now, is that my love for animals was about me. It was very childlike and immature. It was about how they made me feel when I was around them, rather than my love being about what might be best for them, taking their concerns into consideration. And so when I was 24, I went vegetarian, because I thought, like a lot of people do, well, what's the harm in drinking dairy products or consuming eggs, because you're not killing the animal, not realizing that, well, actually, you are killing the animal, but you're just essentially torturing them in various ways before you send them to the slaughterhouse. And then when I was 27, I watched the documentary EARTHLINGS and went vegan immediately. And it was really easy, because just the motivation after watching EARTHLINGS and thinking about what the animals endure in slaughterhouses. I grew up on a farm, but I'd never been inside a slaughterhouse before. I'd never seen inside a slaughterhouse before. I'd only seen, I would say, an idyllic farm like the one I grew up on, which, by the way, still is not free of animal cruelty. Like, still, you're separating mothers from their babies, and they grieve just like humans do, and castrating animals with no painkillers, tail docking, lots of unpleasant experiences that animals endure on even the least cruel farm scenarios. But conventional and modern farming and slaughterhouse practice take it to a whole new level. So after watching EARTHLINGS and getting a glimpse into the food system where my food was coming from grocery stores and restaurants, I went vegan immediately, because I did not want to participate in that. Well, originally I didn't want to go undercover, and originally I was doing like public outreach and various forms of that type of activism. But it was at a animal advocacy camp event where the director of investigations for Mercy for Animals was a guest speaker, and she suggested to me that I should do undercover investigations. And I said, no, I'm too sensitive. I'm not the right guy for the job. Somebody else can do it. But she explained how the impact that you can have in terms of reducing suffering in the world is just so much greater. And understandably, there aren't very many people who will do that work. It's obviously not a fun job. But the way she phrased it, telling me like the impact I would have on it would be millions of animals that are spared the nightmare that is modern farming and in the slaughterhouse. And so originally I said no, but I let the idea bounce around in my head, and after a few weeks I got more and more comfortable with it, and then eventually reached out to Mercy for Animals and became an undercover investigator. The first one I did was at Canada's largest dairy, so Chilliwack cattle sales in Chilliwack, BC. And then I worked at Canada's largest chicken slaughterhouse, Maple Lodge Farms in Ontario. Then I worked for a chicken catching crew in BC. And then the last one was Canada's largest egg farm, Grey Ridge Eggs in Ontario as well. It's exactly what you would imagine it to be. You just apply for any job that's available. Like you'll see a job ad and you just apply for it and send your resume or whatever in and interview just like you would for any job. A lot of them are immigrant workers who don't have the same job prospects that a native Canadian would have. Obviously, they're not particularly desirable jobs, and so I wasn't the only non-immigrant working there, but definitely there's a high percentage of immigrant workers working in these places. Some of the jobs paid a couple extra bucks above minimum wage, but I mean everything was in and around that range. Probably the dairy, the first one, the dairy farm. It was the first place, the first one I did. So I wasn't as desensitized yet, but also I think humans in general, and I'm no exception. I empathize more with mammals than I do with birds. I think like it's more difficult to see a cow suffering than a chicken, and I'd say that's a speciesist and perhaps evolutionary, but a speciesist hiccup of mine. I empathize more with a mammal or any being that's more closely related to me. But I mean, simultaneously, I understand that in their capacity to feel pain and to suffer, there really is no difference between a cow, a pig, or a chicken, or even a fish. I think it's just an evolutionary hiccup. But for that reason, the dairy stands out more, and it was more difficult to watch than say working on a chicken farm. Every time these investigations break, the public is shocked. It's difficult to communicate with the public, and because you're competing with a multi-billion-dollar industry, and so the companies and the industries that are selling these products spend a lot of money to control the public perception of farms and slaughterhouses.
The massive flood of cash and jobs have made the meat lobby one of the most influential legislative groups in Washington. In 2014, they spent more than $4 million lobbying Congress. By comparison, gun control advocates spent less than half that amount.
And so when they see an unfiltered glimpse behind the closed doors of modern farms and slaughterhouses, they're shocked. And so, yeah, so every time an investigation broke, yeah, the public were shocked and outraged at when they see the suffering that's inflicted on these animals. Every investigation that has broken has gotten a lot of media coverage. That one was here in BC, so perhaps locally that gets a lot more pickup than an investigation that breaks on the other side of the country. But I mean, that was brutal. Like chickens getting their legs ripped off. That's just the general one. And even if, say, that wasn't the case, just the standard treatment of animals, it's shocking. It's, so I think that got a lot of media attention, but I think it was probably on a similar level to previous investigations. I'm very optimistic about the future. I believe that in the developed world, within 20 or 30 years, there won't be slaughterhouses anymore. I think the growth of the movement is exponential. That our numbers are growing. The percentage of vegans in society is growing, but also the rate of growth is also increasing. And the reason I think it's increasing is the more people that go vegan, the more it's normalizing compassion and veganism. The more people that go vegan, the more public pressure there is to go vegan, because it's such an obvious case of, it's such an obvious wrong to unnecessarily inflict suffering on a completely innocent being, all for the sake of our own indulgence. Additionally, the more people that go vegan, the easier it becomes to go vegan, because more and more companies are offering vegan products and more options are becoming available in restaurants. Also, like, more and more professional athletes are just smashing the protein myth and excelling in their respective sports. And medical nutritional information is spreading, and I mean, there's a reason why vegans and vegetarians statistically live longer and have lower rates of disease, and so that kind of information is vitiating society as well. And all of these positive feedback loops are just pushing the animal rights agenda forward. Never mind the global warming and like climate crisis, the environment. There's other like, there's so many good reasons to adopt a vegan diet, whether it's your health, the environment, world hunger. Never mind the ethical animal rights argument. And so, like, the best way you calculate the growth of a movement is to measure the doubling time of the percentage of people. And I've heard that it's about 5 years for the percentage of vegans in society to double. And now, for me, since I've been vegan, I've seen a lot of changes, but like when veganism, say 0.5% of society is vegan, when that doubles, you don't really see a big change. But like right now in North America, Canada, and US, vegans and vegetarians are about 4 to 6% of society. So if you were to be conservative and say, let's say 3%, if the doubling time is 5 years, 5 years from now will be 6%. 10 years from now will be 12%. 15 years from now will be 24%. 20 years from now will be 48%, and so on and so forth. And I mean, there's other developments like the proliferation of lab meat, when that becomes much more economically viable. And I mean, you also look at the demographics of veganism. It's the youngest generations that have the highest percentage of vegans. like I think 12% of millennials are vegan or vegetarian. The least vegan demographic is the oldest demographic. And not surprisingly, the oldest people are going to die first. And the youngest people presumably will be around the longest. And I mean, that's just the trend. And if you look at things like other social justice movements, whether like the Gay Pride Parade, in the 70s, the first Gay Pride Parade, it was like, I don't know, 6 dudes walking down the street. Everybody hated them. They would throw rocks and bottles at them. Now, the Gay Pride Parade is, as far as I can tell, the biggest parade and the most global parade on the planet. Businesses, instead of not wanting to be associated and then people throwing rocks and bottles at these guys, businesses pay a lot of money to have their float in the Gay Pride Parade because they want to be associated with that. They want to be on the right side of history. And you look at, like, just in Vancouver, the animal rights marches, they've been, I think, more than doubling every year. Like this, 2 years ago, there was about 150 people who showed up for the Animal Rights March. This last year, it was closer to 400. And in other countries that I would say are more progressive on the animal rights front than Canada, like in Israel, they had over 30,000 people show up to their animal rights parade. That's the biggest animal rights march in history. And I have no doubt that every year they're going to keep breaking that record for the biggest animal rights march, because this movement it's snowballing. It's unstoppable. Like, I'm going to keep working on animal rights issues as much as I can. But even if I gave up, I couldn't stop it. Animal rights is coming, and it's unstoppable. I have different projects that I'm involved in. So I want to, like, I do lots of chalking. Maybe you've seen around town the phrase "chalked." The film "EARTHLINGS" changed my life. I've been chalking that around town, and I've actually come across people who, like, at other animal rights events, where I'll start talking to them about veganism, and they'll say, "Yeah, actually, I've been vegan for 2 weeks now." And I'll say, "Dude, that's awesome. What made you go vegan?" And they'll say, "I saw somebody chalked the phrase, 'The film EARTHLINGS changed my life.'" And so I went home, watched it with my wife. We both went vegan. Then we had our kids watch it. They all went vegan. And I have to think that I'm only going to come in contact with a small percentage of the people who are affected by that. I have to think, like, what are the odds that I would meet the majority of people who are affected by that? So chalking, that's one of my favorite forms of activism. It's easy, and I think using that particular phrase is really effective, because it allows people to watch a documentary in the privacy of their own home, not feeling judged by an activist, someone like myself, explaining it to them, telling them why I think they should be making different dietary choices. So there's that. In Vancouver, we do a lot of Earthlings experience events and Cube of Truth events, which are where we screen modern farm and slaughterhouse footage in public spaces to spread awareness about the suffering animals endure. So soon I'll be getting an outdoor TV, and that'll be a full-time. I'll be doing that full-time. I used to do it full-time, but the TV I was using was just a standard indoor TV and not weatherproof, and didn't really work that well in direct sunlight because it's not designed for that. But this outdoor TV that I should be getting soon is designed to work in direct sunlight. It's much brighter and weatherproof, so I won't be limited by the outdoors. I'd say the most comprehensive documentary on our food choices and the environment would be Cowspiracy. I think it's a great film, and if you want to learn more about the health arguments, I would watch What the Health or Forks Over Knives. And I know there's a new film coming out next year, which looks like it's going to be something kind of like Earthlings, called Dominion. I believe it's based out of, it's either Australia or the UK. I anticipate that being a really good film. In terms of farm animals, I love cows and pigs. But what would I love to see in the wild? A blue whale. They're the biggest animal to have ever existed on the planet, and they're still alive today. They're incredible.